Okay, this is the second part of our 2 week Bible study in the latter part of Matthew 13. So this is Matthew 13, 31 through 35, and 44 through 52. And you remember last week we studied the parable of the weeds, which starts in verse 24 and then finishes in the verses in between this text, verses 36 through 43. So that was the first part. Um, so let me read. I answered the first question for you. Let me read the text for today. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch in its branches. He told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour. It worked all through the dough. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet: I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. Then jumping down to verse 44. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. Once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. When it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on the shore. Then they sat down and collected the good fish in baskets, but threw the bad away. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous and throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all these things? Jesus asked. Yes, they replied. He said to them, therefore, every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old. Oh, all right. Remember that you can download PDF copies of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive. This is the 2 week study on, I think it's listed as Matthew 13, 24 through 52. And so, number one says, what did we talk about in our last study in the text surrounding the beginning of this text? It was the parable of the weeds. And the key note of that was that the enemy was sowing bad seed in with the good seed that the owner of the field sowed. The servants wanted to know, well, first of all, didn't you sow good seed? Um, which I may have overreacted to that question a little bit, but um, those of you who are in ministry might understand why. Um, then, um, then ultimately, they said, "Well, do you want us to pull up the weeds?" And he said, "No, because you're going to end up pulling up the wheat also. So we're going to wait until basically Judgment Day, until the end of time, um, till the return of Jesus, and then the weeds are going to be collected and bundled and burned in the fire, and the wheat will be harvested. And at that time, then we're going to separate the wheat from." So number two says, what are we talking about now according to 13:31? He told them another parable. That's how it starts. He told them another parable. In fact, that's becoming a theme. And I'll just say, you might get tired of these answers for a question as we go through this. So B, the kingdom of heaven is like. That's right. And what is the kingdom of heaven like? A mustard seed which a man took and planted in his field. So maybe I should teach this later, but this is going to be a theme. He told them a parable, and that parable was what the kingdom of heaven is like. And I think we talked about this in the first part of the Bible study last week because that's what he says. Also, in the parable of the weeds, the kingdom of heaven is like. So these are kingdom parables, we call them, because Jesus is describing the kingdom of heaven. When Jesus came preaching, when the John the Baptist came preaching, they both came preaching the kingdom of heaven is near, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And mostly, when we read that, we interpret that to mean that Jesus has come and he's ushering in the kingdom of heaven because he's allowing for salvation and providing the way. Um, and then we say, well, how long till he comes back? Because that's when the kingdom of heaven really, you know, um, comes about. And when we all get to heaven and everything, we talk about heaven as a place out there. What's interesting is Scripture talks about um, what comes after this life and what comes after the return of Jesus as a new heaven and a new earth. Um, and so there will be a new creation. There will be the heavens are sort of out there. And we kind of think, well, we'll be in heaven. I'm not sure if we're sort of, yes, we'll be in the kingdom of heaven, but also the kingdom of heaven is here. It's at hand. It's near. It's come. Jesus ushered in the kingdom of heaven, and when they create when God creates a new heaven and a new earth, um, then I believe also we will be on the earth part, the new earth, the new Jerusalem, and the kingdom of heaven will be there too. And so I think Christians get really confused about the language and oversimplify the language. Um, and I think it's important for us to understand that everything Jesus describes about the kingdom of heaven has to do with what happens here. All of these parables are about what the kingdom of heaven looks like here on earth. So that's something to be thoughtful about. So then, specifically, number 3 says, what is significant about the mustard seed? So he says the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man took and planted in his field. Then he says something about that mustard seed, so when he says the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, for the mustard seed is this. Then he's telling us what the kingdom of heaven is like when he says the mustard seed is this. So A says, though it was, and this is verse 32, though it was the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree so that the birds come and perch in its branches. Um, so specifically, Jesus seems to like the concept of a mustard seed because he talks about us having faith as large as a mustard seed. Because something small can do big things. And sort of Jesus is ushering in what is a fledgling religion ultimately. And even if we were to say that it wasn't a religion, sort of intentionally a separate religion at all, it was a sect of Judaism, um, perhaps the fulfillment of Judaism, and was not supposed to be a sect of Judaism, but even if we talk about Judaism, in the grand scheme of things in the world, this is not a huge religion. So he's saying this thing that is small, because of the power within it, will become big. Um, and we could apply that to the growth of Christianity over the centuries, perhaps, although it doesn't feel like that's appropriate application today because it seems like it's being pushed back, perhaps. Um, but I mean, if you think about how small it started and how big Christianity exploded around the world, But also, I think we can talk about that in terms of what God can do in us. So if the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, then whatever sort of piece of the kingdom of heaven God has put in us um, can have a bigger impact than we understand, than we would expect, because um, there's so much power in the seed. There's so much. The seed is small, but it's so much more than what anybody would expect to come out of that. And this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. Little things have amazing impact in the kingdom of heaven. Um, and I think we can sort of expand the way we interpret that to apply that to our own lives and what God can do through us. Um, when we don't think we have that many gifts, when we don't think we have much influence, God is about bringing huge things from small packages. Number 4, what did Jesus do next? According to 13:33, he told them still another parable. So, give you a hint. Pretty much, when Jesus does another thing in this passage, the thing that he does is probably going to be tell still another parable. So he keeps talking to the people and he keeps talking in parables. And the kingdom of heaven is like. That's how he begins his parable again. So he's going to tell us again what the kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough. Now, if you've ever seen yeast, we've we don't do a lot of baking from scratch. I'll confess. Um, we like yeast rolls, but we tend to buy the frozen ones that when they thaw, they start growing and everything's already done. Um, but I know people do yeast starters and they, sort of expand them. And I have made pizza dough and used yeast. That's the main thing I've used yeast for in our house. But it comes in a bottle and it looks like little pebbles. I mean, it's not much different from a mustard seed in terms of what it looks like. Um, I don't know how much 60 pounds of dough is, but that feels like a lot. And so the miracle of yeast is that it multiplies. It is a quick multiplying live organism. Um, and so you work it in, and it may have been small what you started with, but it multiplies. And so you can work it through a large amount of dough and it will have a large impact. Well, this sounds then like the same parable, doesn't it? Um, Again, it's something, except for that we're going maybe a step beyond talking about something small having a huge impact, and we're adding to it the concept of rapid multiplication. That one of the reasons that the kingdom of heaven a small thing can have a great impact is because the power of multiplication that happens when it takes root in a community or even in a person. That because God has done something so miraculous, um, it has an impact. The kids have been watching The Chosen, which I have not watched up to now, and I think they're starting back at the beginning. And the healing of Mary becomes this enormous um, sort of plot because people can't figure out what did this. So when Jesus got involved, it was something not that the Pharisees didn't do, that Nicodemus had nothing to do with. And again, understand that the chosen has taken artistic liberties, and not everything in the chosen is in the Bible. That's actually pretty important. I know some people, even within our church, have a tendency to sort of uh, watch movies and shows instead of reading the Bible, and their understanding of the Bible comes only from those shows. And I think those shows and movies can be great for sort of visualizing the things of Scripture, and perhaps even people that would never pick up and read Scripture or watching something like that. And getting the gist of Scripture in a way that drives them to Scripture. But I think it's dangerous actually for Christians to go to that instead of Scripture. And it's just one of the reasons that I hadn't watched it before, but my kids are pretty excited about it. So uh, it's on in the house, and I was watching it. So some of these, by the way, plots in these stories are nowhere in Scripture. It's maybe it happened, maybe it didn't, but certainly it is not canon. It is not Scripture. Uh, it is, you know, telling the stories between the stories that might have led to, these things happening that were actually Scripture. Anyway, all of that being said, this sort of healing of Mary was so momentous in the show that um, that it creates kind of a stir. Everybody wants to know how it happened. And by the way, that's exactly why um, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast, because when Jesus acts, the power of God is so powerful, so miraculous that it spreads, and people want to know what's going on, and they go look for the cause of this. And so the gospel is rapidly multiplying. In fact, I would say that the miracle of the gospel is so rapidly multiplying by nature that for the church to be huddled and protective and defensive, and the church not be multiplying, the church has to have surrendered the gospel. I know that was hurtful. I know that was hard to hear. In other words, that we have to have decided that the gospel is not powerful. Decided that the gospel, and I don't know how we do that if we have the gospel, if we've been touched by Jesus. But basically, for the church to be on the defensive and not multiplying, it has to mean that the kingdom of heaven is not there. Because the kingdom of heaven by nature rapidly multiplies. And so if we're holding it in, um, I don't even know how that's possible if we actually have the kingdom of heaven within us. Number 5, why did Jesus speak in these parables? We talked about that before. He who has will be given more, or something like that. So in other words, they asked Jesus why he was speaking parables before, and we were told, um, in the way I described it, and sort of explained what Jesus said, was that he's talking to lost and found all at once. He's talking to the general public and to the people that already have the kingdom within them all at once. And when he talks in a parable, he believes that those with the kingdom within them will immediately understand the nature of God that is presented in that parable, but everybody around them will not. So it's sort of code speak to the followers, and those who receive Jesus, receive his spirit, receive his presence into their life, will receive also discernment and will begin to understand those things. But those outside will just not understand it. And so it's his way of speaking to the people of God, even when there are people all around that may not be a part of it. So now that being said, B says, well, Matthew loves to remind us that Jesus fulfills the Old Testament prophecy. So he sends us to Psalm 78 too, which is what's quoted here when it says, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. So, so Matthew uses this opportunity to remind us that Jesus, in speaking in parables, is fulfilling the prophecy that was written about him in Psalms, uh, that he would tell secrets of the kingdom, uh, hidden since the creation of the world, and he would speak them in parables. Number 6, what did Jesus do next after he explained the parable from last week? So we're skipping down according to 1344. It sounds like another parable, but he doesn't say that this time. So it says he goes straight to the kingdom of heaven is like. He doesn't say it doesn't. Matthew doesn't sort of contextualize or narrate and say he told them still another parable, but it's clear that it is because he jumps right into the kingdom of heaven is like. And what is the kingdom of heaven like this time? Um, a treasure hidden in a field. Um, and what is the significance of a treasure hidden in a field? Well, it's hidden. If somebody finds it, they're going to hide it again, and now this field is valuable. So if the kingdom of heaven is a treasure and it's in this field, then this field is now valuable, and it's the most value. It's more valuable than anything I own. So the man would be willing to go and sell everything that he has and buy the field, not so that he could have the field, because the field didn't have the treasure in it. It's not valuable, not that valuable, not more valuable than everything he owns. But if it has that treasure in it, it is. So he would sell everything and buy the field so that he can get at that treasure and that it would belong to him. And that's how valuable the kingdom of heaven is. So we're learning something about the value of the kingdom, how big a deal the gospel is, how big a deal the news of Jesus Christ is, which is why it's crazy. The only reason this guy hid it was so that he could gain access to it by selling it without the field value going up, um, because he wanted to get a hold of it. But um, but for us to hide what we have, that's why we got to take all the parables. The metaphors only go so far, right? We should not be hiding the gospel, the kingdom of heaven. Um, The only reason he was hiding it in this parable is because of how valuable it was, so that he could get access to it before somebody else went in and stole it or bought the field for more money than he was able to gather. Um, so now, what about 1345? I think I'm getting the pattern by now. In other words, the kingdom of heaven is like. And the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. So this is essentially the same parable. I'm thinking about in Genesis when there's, the Pharaoh has two dreams, and Joseph interprets the dreams, and he says the dreams are one and the same. In this case, the parables are one and the same. The merchant was looking for fine pearls, and he found them, and the ones that he found were more expensive than he had been prepared to buy. I don't know if that's ever happened to you. So I like estate sales. I go to estate sales, and I don't have a lot of money. Actually, that's one reason why I do go to estate sales, is because I can buy nice stuff for cheap, and it's used. But oftentimes I go in, and there's some beautiful furniture, and there's things like that, and I'm like, man, I would really like to have that, but honestly, I don't have the money for it. Um, and I already have furniture, so I don't really need that. So I don't really buy it. In fact, usually I'll walk out of an estate sale with a couple more cookie sheets, because we always need more cookie sheets. We got a couple that we put our bacon in. We don't fry our bacon; we bake our bacon these days, uh, and that kind of greases them all up and makes them so you don't really want to make cookies on them. So we have different pans that we use for different things. Cookie sheets store easy, so we got a ton of them. I'll get like cupcake or muffin tins. I'll get water bottles because my family uses water bottles and they buy them up and they use them like they're going out of style, but they also lose them at about the same rate. So if there's water bottles that are nice and I can pick them up for $1 or two, I buy those things at estate sales. Um, I go in these days because I've started uh, playing and collecting hobby games, and every now and then I'll see games. Good hobby games sometimes that are undervalued in that setting. Sometimes just historic old, mass market games, which I like to. Someday I'd like to decorate a room with games on the wall. Anyway, antiques and that sort of thing. Um, but all that said, like I'm going in there to buy something, but I'm not going in there with $1,000 in my pocket or even in my account if I wanted to use a card or anything. I'm not going in there like that. But if I found something that I knew was absolutely worth it and was undervalued in some way, and I could somehow get this, but I didn't have enough money, I would go find the money. And that's the idea. Is this guy came in expecting to buy pearls, and he found a pearl that was more valuable than he expected. And so he was not prepared to buy it, so he had to go out and sell everything he had and come back. Um, but the point is that that's what he was willing to do once he found one that he saw the value in. And I think that's the thing that Jesus is trying to express to us is the kingdom of heaven is very valuable, valuable enough that if you experience it, if you find it, you should be willing to go out and sell everything you have for it. That's how valuable it is. The question is, when you see it, do you recognize its value enough to be willing to go do that? Because that's what it's worth. And I would say that a whole lot of people in the church recognize the value of the gospel or the kingdom of heaven enough to hang around people that have it, but not enough to go sell everything they have to have it for themselves. And honestly, we could argue that we don't have to buy it, we don't have to earn it, so we don't have to go sell everything we have. But I think the reason that Jesus told this parable is because obedience to God sometimes means walking away from some of the things that we value now, and therefore sometimes it does cost us that. Um, so okay, number 8. What about 1347? I think you got this one on your own by now. It should be on your own. In other words, I don't have to list. You know what it's about to say. The kingdom of heaven is like. So in 47, he says, once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down to a lake and caught all kinds of fish. When it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on shore. Then they sat down and collected the good fish in baskets, but they threw the bad away. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous and throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Uh, so, so this sort of harkens back to the parable of the weeds, because he's talking about at the end of the age. So we're going to pull up a net. It's going to have good fish and bad fish, but they're going to be separated. And he kind of comes out of his parable and into the explanation in this one. That's why it's a little longer. And he says the angels will separate the wicked from the righteous at the end of the age. So number 9 says, what does Jesus ask them in 1351? Have you understood all these things? They replied, yes. The second part of the question says, what about you? Explain each truth about the kingdom of heaven. Remember last week's parable of the weeds. Um, Last week's parable of the weeds ends with the same as this fish net let down into the lake. That is, they'll be separated. At the end of the age, they'll be separated. The good from the bad, and the bad will be burned up. But before that, one of the points of the parable is that we're not to pull up um, the weeds now because we might pull up some wheat. So the separation does not happen till the end, which is frustrating to us many times when we're looking at the church and we see, and I know this was about the world, not just the church, but when we're looking at the church and we see people that are not serving God and we know it, but they're claiming to be people that serve God. Paul writes in his letters about how to tell people apart because there were false prophets and things like that. Um, and it's frustrating sometimes to see, well, what about this person? They haven't been struck dead. They don't seem to be being punished for their sin. They're pretending like they're righteous, and that way, they're sinful and they're pretending like they're righteous, which is causing problems among the rest of our folks because they think this is okay now. Um, but we just all need to know that the ultimate judgment will come at the end, and that's when separation will happen. The mustard seed, it's small, but it has great power. There's much in it. It becomes one of the largest plants of the garden that birds can even nest in. The yeast working through the dough, very similar. Um, Small, but has great impact. But maybe the added implication of it has great impact because it's power for multiplication. D, a treasure hidden in the field. The merchant looking for pearls. So these are told in quick succession, and both of them are saying there's something very valuable that's worth selling everything that you have. Um, and we need to understand the value of the kingdom of heaven. And then that let down into the lake. We're going to pull up everything, good and bad, but then they're going to be separated. And number 10, what does Jesus say about the teachers of the law who become disciples? He said to them, therefore, every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of the house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old. So this is a parable in and of itself. And this is, I think, helpful from Matthew's perspective, again, for talking to a Jewish audience that is wondering how the gospel of Jesus Christ impacts their Jewishness, their understanding of the law. And he says, every teacher of the law who becomes a disciple. So this is somebody who is Old Testament, Pharisee, teacher of the law, somebody that understands the Old Testament and what God says to us through that, has become a teacher, has become a disciple. So now this is somebody who now follows Jesus and understands Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament. He now brings new treasures out as well as old. So in other words, this is very much saying what Jesus said, which is, I haven't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So a teacher of the law, somebody who was an Old Testament Jew to the highest level, who becomes a disciple, now teaches the Old Testament truths as well as the New Testament truths. Now teaches not only what the Old Testament says, but also what the kingdom of heaven is like from a New Testament perspective now that it has come near. Um, and so I really think that a big part of this is Matthew, again, from the words of Jesus, explaining how um, Jesus fulfills the Old Testament and how these should be understood together. Um, and that we should not abandon all the Old Testament teachings just to talk about Jesus' kingdom of heaven teachings. but that Jesus' kingdom of heaven teachings fulfill what the Old Testament told us. So these are kingdom parables.